Preston Hargrove picked up the stack of script pages from the table, weighed it in his hand for a moment as though deciding what it was worth, and then threw it. It hit the man in the worn leather jacket square in the chest and burst apart in the air. 140 pages came loose all at once and went everywhere, sliding across the polished mahogany of the boardroom table, fanning out across the carpet, drifting down past the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 41st floor of Meridian Pictures, where the whole gleaming sprawl of Century City lay spread out in the morning sun. "Who let this guy in here?" Preston Hargrove said. His voice carried the easy contempt of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no. "Somebody who looks like he came to fix the air conditioning, sitting in my boardroom. Pick up your little stack of papers and get out of my building." The man in the worn jacket did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or his hand. He looked at Preston Hargrove for one long, unhurried moment, and then he crouched down and began to gather the pages from the floor, one at a time, smoothing each one against his knee, squaring the edges, building the scattered script back into a neat stack, while 12 executives sat around the long table and watched, and not one of them moved to help. His name was Keanu Reeves. He was 59 years old, and Preston Hargrove had just thrown across the floor the one project that could have saved his studio, into the face of the one man who had come to save it, and he did not know any of that yet. There is a particular kind of arrogance that does not bother to look closely at anything. It takes in a jacket, a pair of worn boots, a few days of stubble, a man who does not announce himself, and it arrives in under a second at a complete and confident verdict, and then it spends all of its considerable energy defending that verdict against the inconvenience of facts. Preston Hargrove had that kind of arrogance. He had built a career on the belief that he could read a person at a glance, that 20 years in the industry had given him an instinct that did not miss. Hold on to that. It matters later, in ways Preston could not possibly have imagined while he stood there, watching a man he had decided was nobody kneel on his carpet and gather paper in silence. But let me take you back to the beginning of that morning and show you who the man on the floor actually was. Because almost nobody at Meridian Pictures knew, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. Keanu Reeves woke that morning at 5:45 in a modest house in the hills above Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where the other houses were large, and his was not, because he had bought the smallest one on the street 30 years ago and had never seen a reason to move. He made his own coffee. He stood at the kitchen window for a few minutes and watched the light come up gray and then gold over the canyon, the way he did. Most mornings, a small private ritual he protected, because the rest of his life did not leave much room for stillness. On the counter beside him sat a script in a plain cardstock cover, dog-eared and marked up in 3 colors of ink, a story he had been carrying for the better part of 6 years. He was a wealthy man, though he worked hard to make sure it did not show, and the not showing was not vanity in reverse. It was something closer to self-defense. He had learned, across a long life lived partly in front of cameras, that the moment people knew what you were worth, they stopped seeing you and started seeing the number. And he had decided somewhere in his 40s that he would rather be underestimated than handled. So he drove an old car. He wore the same few jackets until the leather went soft and pale at the seams. He gave enormous amounts of money away through channels that did not carry his name, and the giving was the part of his life he thought about most and spoke about least. The script was the thing he cared about now. It was not a franchise. It was not the kind of loud, expensive picture that the town knew how to make in its sleep. It was a small, strange, human story about an aging stuntman and the daughter of a man he had failed to save. And Keanu's had decided, after 6 years of circling it, that he was going to produce it himself, finance the lion's share of it himself through the production company he quietly owned, and play the stuntman himself, because it was the kind of role that came along once in a career, and he was old enough now to know it. Here is the part that nobody at Meridian Pictures knew. The production company was called Halcyon Pictures, and over 15 years it had quietly put its money and its name behind a long string of films that the industry respected. a few of which had won the kind of awards that the industry pretended not to care about and cared about enormously. Halcyon did not have a famous face attached to it in the public mind. It had a reputation among the people who actually made movies as the company that treated its crews well, that paid its below-the-line people on time, that did not scream on its sets, that could be trusted. The man who founded Halcyon, who funded it, who sat in its small offices and read every script that came through the door himself, did not put his name on the masthead. His name was Keanu Reeves. He had come to Meridian Pictures that morning for a specific reason. Meridian wanted the stuntman picture. Their head of production had read it, loved it, understood it, and had been pushing it inside the building for months. And Keanu had a decision to make, because Halcyon could finance the picture anywhere, with any partner. And the only question that mattered to him was which partner would treat the people who made it like human beings. So he had done what he always did when he was deciding whether to trust a place with something he loved. He had not sent his lawyers ahead with a term sheet. He had put on his oldest jacket and driven his old car to the studio himself, to walk into it looking like nobody, and find out from the inside how it treated a nobody. Because you could not learn that from a meeting where everyone knew who you were. Everyone behaved in those meetings. You could learn the truth of a place by being, for an hour, the kind of person it did not have to behave for. He had learned this the hard way, over a long career, and the lesson had cost him before he understood it. There had been projects early on that he had taken into beautiful buildings full of charming people who treated him like a prince, and he had signed on, and then he had watched those same charming people scream at a camera assistant over a coffee order, or humiliate a young costumer until she cried in a trailer, or leave a stunt crew in unsafe conditions because fixing them would cost a day. He had learned that how a place treats its powerful guests tells you nothing, and how it treats the person it thinks is no one tells you everything. And he had decided, somewhere in the middle of his life, that he would not give his work, or his name, or the years of his one finite life that it took to make a film, to people who were only kind when kindness was being watched. So now, before every important partnership, he ran the same quiet test. He arrived as no one. He watched what happened. It had saved him from a dozen bad rooms. It was about to tell him everything he needed to know about Meridian Pictures in the space of a single morning. He was about to learn the truth of Meridian Pictures. It was not going to be the truth Meridian would have wanted him to find. Meridian occupied the top 15 floors of a glass tower in Century City, all chrome and white stone, and the particular hush of a place where a great deal of money changes hands quietly. The lobby had a 40-foot ceiling and a wall of awards behind the reception desk and a fountain that made a sound engineered to be soothing. Keanu walked in at 20 to 9, the script under his arm in its plain cover, and crossed the marble toward the front desk. And the young woman behind it looked up at him, and her eyes did the thing he had watched eyes do his whole life. They moved from his face to his jacket to his boots, and they performed a small, fast, silent act of arithmetic, and they reached a total, and the total was not important. "Can I help you?" she said. It was not really a question. "Keanu Reeves. I have a 9 o'clock with your head of production." She looked at her screen. She scrolled. She looked again, with the small frown of someone who has not found what she is looking for and has decided the fault lies with the person in front of her, rather than the system in front of her. "I don't see, hold on." She gestured, without quite looking at him, toward a bench tucked into an alcove near a service corridor, beside a door marked with the symbol for a supply closet. Not the visitor's lounge with its leather chairs and its sparkling water and its view of the fountain, the bench by the closet. "You can wait over there. Someone will come down." Keanu did not argue. He had long ago stopped expending energy on the first small indignity, because the first one told you everything you needed to know about whether there would be a second. He went to the bench. He sat with the script on his lap, and he waited. It was while he was waiting that he met the only person in the entire building who would come out of that morning with his dignity intact, and it is worth slowing down for him. Because he is the heart of this. More than the money, more than the reckoning, more than any of it. His name was Walter Pruitt, and he was 68 years old. And he had worked the security and reception desk in the lobby of that tower for 25 years, since before Meridian had taken the upper floors, back when the building still had a newsstand and a shoeshine man and a different name over the door. Walter had a bad hip and a kind face, and a way of seeing people that the rest of the building had lost somewhere on the way up. He noticed the man on the bench by the supply closet. He noticed the plain cover of the script. He noticed, mostly, that a man had been parked by the janitor's door, like a delivery nobody had ordered, and that nobody had brought him so much as a glass of water. So Walter did. He filled a paper cup at the cooler and carried it over on his bad hip and held it out. "They've got you waiting in the worst seat in the house," Walter said. "Figured you could use this." "Thank you," Keanu said, and took the cup, and something in the way he said it, the genuine surprise in it, told Walter that this was a man who was not used to being handed things, which was interesting, because in Walter's long experience, the people who ended up on that bench usually were. They talked for a few minutes. Walter did most of it, the easy practiced patter of a man who had spent a quarter-century making strangers feel less alone in a cold lobby. He asked what the man was in for, and Keanu said a meeting about a movie. And Walter said he'd seen a lot of movies get made and a lot more get talked about and never made. And that the talking about paid the same rent either way. "You in the business?" Keanu asked, and there was real curiosity in it, not the polite kind. "Was," Walter said. "Long time ago. 2 years as a grip, back when this town still made things with its hands. Rigging, mostly. Then my back went the first time, and a man with a bad back is no use on a crew, so." He shrugged, an old shrug worn smooth by 50 years of use. Ended up watching the door instead of working behind the camera. Worse seat, better hours. He smiled. "I still watch how they light a lobby, though. Can't turn it off. You spend 2 years learning to see how light falls on a face, and you see it the rest of your life, whether you want to or not." Keanu looked at the old man with something that was almost recognition, because that was a thing he understood precisely. The way a craft gets into your eyes and never leaves them, and the two of them sat for a moment in the easy quiet of people who have loved the same difficult thing. And then Walter looked at the man's face a little longer than was polite, and a flicker of something moved behind his eyes. Because Walter Pruitt had spent those 2 years of his youth watching faces the way a movie man watches faces. And he had never entirely stopped. And he knew, suddenly and completely, exactly who was sitting on the bench by the supply closet drinking water from a paper cup. But Walter Pruitt had also spent 68 years learning when a thing was his to say and when it was not. He could see the worn jacket and the unannounced arrival and the plain-covered script, and he understood that the man was here in disguise, was here precisely to not be known, and that the kindest thing a person could do was let him have it. A lesser man would have made it about himself, would have said, Your face is familiar. Do I know you from somewhere?" Would have reached for the small, reflected importance of having recognized someone. Walter did none of that. He just refilled the man's water without being asked, and told him a story about the time the fountain broke and flooded the lobby up to the ankles of a famous director who shall remain nameless, and let Keanu Reeves be nobody for as long as the building would allow it. It was, Keanu would think later, the single most dignified thing anyone did for him in that entire building, and the man who did it had the least reason of anyone to bother. And that was exactly the point, though it would take the rest of the day for the point to finish making itself. The building allowed it for about 25 minutes. Then a tall, nervous man in an expensive suit came hurrying out of the elevator bank, scanning the lobby, and his face flooded with relief and then with something closer to fear when he spotted the man on the bench. "Mr. Reeves." He crossed the lobby fast. "Mr. Reeves, I am so sorry. I'm Howard Keller. I'm the CO. We had you. There's been a mix-up at the desk. Please, I am so sorry. Come up." He shot a look at the young receptionist that could have stripped paint, and she went pale, beginning to understand that she had made some category of error she could not yet measure. Howard Keller knew exactly who Keanu Reeves was. He had seen the Halcyon paperwork. He had spent 3 months trying to get this picture set up inside the building, and he knew that the quiet man on the bench was not just talent, and was not just a financier, but was the whole deal, the money and the name and the star. The single most important visitor the studio had received in a year, and he had just found him parked by a supply closet, drinking from a paper cup. As they rode the elevator up to 41, Howard Keller kept adjusting his tie, and his hands would not stay still. Because he also knew the man they were going up to see, and he had a sick premonition, climbing through the numbers, of how this was about to go. He had tried to prepare Preston. That was the thing that would eat at him most afterward, that he had actually tried. He had put a briefing in Preston's inbox 3 days earlier, 2 pages, who Halcyon was, who ran it, what the package was worth, why it mattered, and at the top, in bold, the name of the man who would be coming in person. He had no way of knowing that Preston had not read it, that Preston rarely read anything Howard sent him, because Preston had long ago decided that reading was a thing other people did, so that he would not have to. So Howard rode up in the elevator believing, against the evidence of 20 years, that the briefing would hold, that even Preston could not, fumble something this large. He believed it right up until the doors opened on 41, and even a little while after that, in the way that people keep believing in a thing for a few seconds after it has already broken. Because the alternative is to start falling. Walter Pruitt watched them step into the elevator. He watched the doors close, and the old man went back to his desk with a small, private smile, because he had recognized a king in a borrowed coat, and he had given the king a cup of water and asked for nothing, and that, to Walter, was simply how you were supposed to treat a man. Any man, whether he turned out to be a king or not. The elevator opened on 41. A long hall of glass-walled offices, a wall of framed one-sheets from the studio's better years, and at the end of it a set of double doors. And behind those doors the boardroom, with its mahogany table and its crystal water pitchers and its 12 leather chairs and its wall of windows, looking out over the whole bright machine of the city that makes the world's dreams and chews up a great many people in the making of them. 12 executives were already seated when Howard Keller opened the door and Keanu stepped inside. And the door at the far end of the room opened at the same moment, and Preston Hargrove walked in last. The way he always walked in last, because a man who walks in last has made everyone else wait. And making people wait was, to Preston, the purest expression of power he knew. Preston Hargrove was 56 years old, and he was the chief executive of Meridian Pictures. And he had walked into 10,000 rooms in his life, believing that he owned each one the moment he crossed the threshold. He had a tailored charcoal suit and a watch worth more than most people's cars, and the deep, unshakable confidence of a man who had been told he was right so many times that he had stopped checking. He scanned the table, nodding at the faces he approved of, and then his eyes reached the man standing near the head of it in the worn leather jacket, and they stopped, and his whole face changed. It is worth being precise about what Preston saw, because the seeing was the entire crime. He saw a jacket that had not come from any store he shopped in. He saw boots with scuffs on them. He saw a man with stubble and unstyled hair, who had not flown a publicist in ahead of him to announce his importance, and in the private arithmetic of Preston Hargrove. Importance that did not announce itself did not exist. He did not look at the man's face long enough to register it. He did not need to. He had already decided. "Who's this?" Preston said to the room, as though the man were a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. Howard Keller stepped forward, and his voice had a thin, careful quality. "Preston, this is the producer on the project I've been telling you about. This is the package we've been trying to land. This is a very important meeting. I sent you the materials. This is the lead investor and the attached talent, and I really think if we just sit down, we can." "I can see what this is," Preston said, and he had not looked at Howard either. He was looking at the jacket. He crossed the room toward Keanu, slow, deliberate, every step a small assertion, and he stopped a few feet away, close enough to be personal, far enough to make it clear he would not be closing the distance. Keanu set the script on the table and extended his hand. It was an ordinary gesture, the most basic unit of professional respect, the thing that happens 10,000 times a day in buildings exactly like this one. Preston looked at the hand. He looked at the jacket. He did not take it. I don't know who told you that you could walk in here dressed like you're about to detail my car, Preston said, but somebody upstairs made a mistake, and I'm going to correct it. He turned half away, already dismissing, and then turned back, because men like Preston cannot resist the last twist of the knife. We have a certain standard at this studio, a certain level, and whatever you are, you're not it. And then he picked up the script from the table, the 6 years of work in its plain cardstock cover, and he weighed it in his hand, and he threw it. We are back now to where we began. The pages in the air, the 140 sheets coming apart and sliding across the mahogany and drifting to the floor. The man in the worn jacket crouching down, unhurried, to gather them. What Preston did not understand, what he could not have understood, because understanding it would have required him to have looked, was that the room had just divided itself permanently into two kinds of people. There were the people who would for the rest of their lives remember that they had sat at that table and watched, and he's a man's work thrown on the floor and said nothing. And there was the man on the floor who would remember nothing about it at all, because he had been treated worse than this by smaller men than this and had learned a long time ago that the contempt of a Preston Hargrove was not an injury. It was information. There were 12 of them around that table, and it is worth pausing on them, because they are the part of this that is easiest to judge and hardest to be honest about. 12 people with graduate degrees and corner offices and salaries that put them in the top fraction of a fraction of the country. 12 people who, if you had asked any of them at a dinner party the week before, would have told you with total sincerity that of course they would speak up. That of course they would never sit silent while another human being was humiliated. That they were not those people. And then the moment came, the actual moment, not the hypothetical one, and the actual moment had Preston Hargrove in it. And Preston Hargrove signed their bonuses and greenlit their projects and could end their careers in this town with 3 phone calls. And so all 12 of them discovered, in the space of about 40 seconds, that they were in fact exactly those people. One of them, a younger executive named Dana, opened her mouth and got as drawing the breath to speak, and then looked at Preston's face and let the breath out again, and hated herself for it, and would go on hating herself for it for a long time. That is not villainy. It is something more ordinary and more useful to understand than villainy. It is what fear does to decent people who have not practiced courage, and the lesson of it is not that the 12 were monsters. The lesson is that courage is a muscle, and a muscle you have never used will not answer when you finally call on it. Keanu gathered the pages. He took his time. He smoothed each one against his knee and squared the edges and built the script back into a stack. And the silence in the room stretched out and became unbearable for everyone in it except the one person it should have been unbearable for, who was kneeling on the carpet perfectly at peace, and the one man who could not bear it at all, who was Howard Keller, standing frozen by the door at all with his jaw clenched so hard the muscle in its chunks jumped. You know what your problem is, Preston said to the kneeling man, because the silence had begun to feel like a thing he was losing, and he needed to win it. People like you think showing up is the same as belonging. It isn't. You can walk into a room like this, but you can't be in it. There's difference. You'll never understand the difference. That's how I know you don't belong. Keanu stood, the script now whole again in his hands. He looked at Preston Hargrove, and there was no anger in his face, and no shame, which was the thing that unsettled the room most, because anger they would have understood, and shame they would have known what to do with, and this was neither. It was a kind of calm so complete that it made the loud man in the expensive suit look, suddenly, very small and very young. "Are you finished?" Keanu asked. The question was not a challenge. It was almost gentle. "I'm finished when you're out of my building," Preston said. Keanu nodded once, slowly, as though something had been confirmed that he had merely suspected. "Okay." he said. And he turned and walked toward the door, and his boots made no sound on the carpet. And he did not slam anything. And he did not say anything. And he did not look back at the 12 people who had watched and done nothing. And the door closed behind him with a soft click that was somehow louder than any slam could have been. Preston turned back to his table and straightened his cuffs and let a thin smile cross his face. "Anyway," he said, "where were we? Let's talk about something that matters." And the room, God help it, obeyed. Notes were consulted. Conversations resumed. 12 people who had law degrees and MBAs and corner offices arranged their faces and pretended they had not just watched a man be humiliated for the crime of wearing the wrong jacket. Only Howard Keller sat rigid, his pen in his hand, not writing, the muscle still jumping in his cheek, because Howard Keller knew exactly what had just walked out of the room, and he knew exactly what it was going to cost, and he said nothing. Because fear is a kind of gravity, and he was not, in that moment, strong enough to climb out of it. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed, and the noise of the 41st floor vanished, and he was, for the first time in half an hour, alone. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone and pressed one contact. It rang twice. The voice that answered belonged to Eli Brandt, who had been Keanu's partner at Halcyon for 15 years, who had built the company with him from 2 desks and a shared assistant, who trusted Keanu's read on people the way you trust a compass. "How'd it go?" Keanu watched the floor numbers count down. 40, 39, 38. He was quiet for a moment, not out of anger, but out of the care of a man who does not make decisions he cannot stand behind. "Pull it," he said. "All of it. We're not making it here." Eli did not ask why. In 15 years, he had learned that when Keanu said a thing like that in that particular tone, the why was already settled and was always the same why underneath. Somebody had shown Keanu who they were, and Keanu had believed them. "Where do you want it to go?" Eli asked. "Let me think about that," Keanu said. "But get us out of Meridian today. Clean, no drama, just gone." He hung up. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. He crossed the marble, and as he passed the reception desk, the young woman who had sent him to the bench by the closet looked up and went white. Because in the last 20 minutes, some frantic word had come down from 41 about exactly who the man in the worn jacket was, and she opened her mouth to say, and found that there was nothing to say. Keanu did not slow down. He stopped only once, at the security desk by the door, where Walter Pruitt sat. "Thank you for the water," Keanu said, and he meant it, and Walter saw that he meant it. "Anytime," Walter said. "You get what you came for?" Keanu considered that. "I got the answer to the question I came to ask," he said. "It wasn't the answer they wanted me to find." And he smiled, a real one, tired and warm. And he went out through the glass doors into the bright Los Angeles morning and disappeared into the ordinary river of the city. Just a man in a worn jacket carrying a script. Nobody special, nobody worth a second look, and a project worth more than anything. Preston Hargrove would touch for the rest of his career, had just changed direction. And Preston had no idea, and would have no idea for 2 more weeks. Howard Keller excused himself from the boardroom 20 minutes later, walked down the hall to the men's room, locked the door, and gripped the edge of the sink. His hands were not steady. He looked at himself in the mirror, at a man who had spent 3 months and a great deal of his own credibility getting the most important package in the studio's recent history through the door, and who had then sat in a chair and watched the chief executive throw it on the floor and call the man who owned it a car detailer, and who had said nothing. He should have spoken. He had known who Keanu was. One sentence. "Preston, do you have any idea who that is?" One sentence and the whole catastrophe might have been arrested. He had not said the sentence. He had truly been afraid of Preston, the way the whole building was afraid of Preston. And the fear had cost him the sentence. And the missing sentence was going to cost the studio everything. He dried his face. He straightened his tie. He went back into the boardroom and sat down and picked up his pen. And like everyone else at the table, he said nothing, and the not saying settled into his chest and began quietly to rot there. That was the strange cruelty of it, the part Howard would turn over for months. The cost of speaking would have been so small. Not nothing. Preston might have humiliated him, too. Might have made the next few weeks miserable, but small, survivable. The kind of cost a grown man with savings and options could absorb. And the cost of silence had felt, in the moment, like nothing at all, like simply declining to make a scene. That was the trick of it. Silence always presents itself as the free option, the safe option, the option with no price tag. And you only find out much later, when the bill comes due, that it was the most expensive thing in the room. Howard had chosen the expensive thing because in the moment it had looked free. Almost everyone does. That is how places like Meridian are built, not by a single cruel man at the top, but by 100 decent people below him, each quietly choosing the thing that looks free over and over, until the looking free thing has cost them everything that mattered about the place they worked. 2 weeks passed, and in those 2 weeks, Preston Hargrove did not think about the man in the worn jacket a single time. He had erased him the way you brush lint from a sleeve. He went to his lunches at the club on the west side, and his dinners at the restaurants, where the maitre d' knew his name. And he told the story once or twice at those dinners as a joke. The morning, some hobo wandered into his boardroom, and the people at the table laughed because Preston was paying, and that was the arrangement. He did not ask Howard Keller who the man had been. He did not look at the project Howard had been championing. The man had not been important, and so the man had not happened. And then, 14 days after a script hit the floor of the 41st floor boardroom, the first quiet thing went wrong. It is worth understanding, before we get to the dominoes, exactly how exposed Meridian Pictures actually was, because Preston had spent years making sure no one looked too closely at it, least of all himself. From the outside, the studio was a fortress. The lobby fountain, the wall of awards, the 41st floor view, all of it was designed to communicate permanence, the sense that money like this had always been here, and always would be. But the truth, which lived in spreadsheets Preston found tedious and rarely read, was that Meridian had not had a real hit in 3 years. It had been living on the fumes of its library and on a slate of projects that were all, every one of them, dependent on outside financing that Preston assumed would always be available, because it always had been. He treated investors the way he treated everyone, as people who needed him more than he needed them. And for a long time the arrangement had held, because a rising studio can afford an arrogant man at the top. A sinking one cannot. Preston did not know the studio was sinking. That was the first thing the man in the worn jacket had understood about Meridian, that Preston himself had never bothered to learn. So when Halcyon withdrew, it did not pull one stone. It pulled the stone the whole arch leaned on. It went wrong quietly the way the important things usually do. Not with an announcement. With an email landing in Howard Keller's inbox at 6:41 in the morning, while Howard was already at his desk, because he had not been sleeping well since the day he watched a man's work hit the floor and kept his mouth shut. It was a formal notice. 3 paragraphs, courteous and final, from Halcyon Pictures, withdrawing from all discussions regarding the project and any future collaboration with Meridian Pictures, effective immediately. Howard read it once and felt the floor tilt. He read it a second time and understood that the floor was not going to tilt back. Here? About the package Preston Hargrove had thrown on the floor, the thing Preston had never bothered to learn, because learning it would have required him to sit down and listen to Howard Keller for 10 minutes. It was not just a script. Halcyon was financing the larger share, yes, but Halcyon's involvement, and the star attached to it, had been the reason a major distribution partner had come to the table, and the distributor coming to the table had been the reason too. Other investors had committed to Meridian's slate for the year. Pull that out of a studio already living on fumes, and you do not lose one project. You lose the season. Howard called Eli Brandt. It went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sent an email marked urgent and got nothing, and a second and a third, and the silence that came back was not an accident and not an oversight. It was a decision, total and deliberate and quiet, and Howard recognized it because it was the same silence the man in the worn jacket had walked out into 2 weeks before. He closed his office door and sat in the dark for a while. Then he went down the hall and knocked on Preston's door. Preston was on the phone, laughing about a boat. He waved Howard in without looking at him and finished his call at his leisure, because making Howard wait was, like making everyone wait, a small pleasure he never denied himself. Finally, he hung up. What? The Halcyon package. It's gone. They withdrew this morning. Everything. Preston's smile did not vanish all at once. It came apart in pieces, the corners of the mouth first, then the eyes. What do you mean, gone? I mean, gone. Pulled. And the distributor's going to follow Preston. And if the distributor follows, Whitfield and the Carver Group follow, because they were only ever in because of the package. And that's, Preston, that's the year. That's the whole year. That's not possible. Get them on the phone. I've tried. 11 times. They won't take my calls. Then try a 12th time, Preston said, and there was, for the first time, something under the contempt that had not been there before. Something with a faster pulse. Who do they think they are? Some boutique finance shop and a washed-up actor in a leather jacket, walking away from Meridian Pictures. Get them back on the phone and remind them who they're dealing with. And Howard Keller looked at his chief executive and understood, with a sinking finality, that Preston still did not know. Had not connected the withdrawal to the morning, had thrown the man up on the floor so completely that he had never once wondered what the man could do. Howard did not tell him. He told himself, later, that there had not been a way to say it that Preston would have heard. But the truth was simpler and worse. He was still afraid of him, so he went back to his office and called a 12th time, and a 13th, and the silence held, and the arch began, stone by stone, to come down. The distributor stepped back within the week, citing a change in the financing structure. Whitfield pulled out 4 days after that. The Carver Group, 90 seconds on the phone, we've reviewed our position, we're going to sit this cycle out. Click. 3 projects on the studio slate went into turnaround for lack of funding. A co-financing deal that had taken a year to build evaporated in an afternoon. Preston raged through all of it. Threatened lawsuits, his own attorney patiently explained, were unwinnable. Fired the attorney, rehired him by lunch, blamed the market, blamed Howard, blamed a culture that he said no longer rewarded real vision, and never once, not for a single second, blamed the only person whose fingerprints were on every piece of the wreckage, which was himself. There is something almost impressive about the completeness of it, the way Preston Hargrove's mind sealed itself against the truth. Every theory he constructed pointed outward. The investors were cowards. The market was soft. Howard was incompetent. Halcyon was running some kind of vendetta, though he could not say why a firm he had never heard of 3 weeks ago would have a vendetta against him, and he did not try to say why, because the question, if he had let himself ask it, led directly to a memory he had already worked very hard to erase. A morning, a worn jacket, a stack of paper in the air. He never let himself ask it. The human mind is capable of remarkable feats of architecture when its job is to keep a man from seeing the one thing that would require him to change. And Preston's mind built cathedrals. He sat in his office while the studio came apart around him and constructed, brick by brick, an entire universe in which he was the victim of forces beyond his control. And he moved into that universe. And he lived there for the rest of his life. And he was, in his own telling, always, to the end, the wronged party. Some people you cannot save from themselves. You can only stop being the thing they blame, and let the silence do the rest. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a story like this usually starts to feel like a fantasy, where the bad man loses everything in a tidy avalanche and the credits roll. It did not happen that cleanly, and it did not happen that fast, and the people who got hurt worst were not the ones who deserved it. The studio did not vanish. It contracted. And when a studio contracts, the people who lose their jobs are not the Preston Hargroves. They are the assistants and the coordinators and the post-production crew. The people who had never been within 40 floors of that boardroom, who had never heard the name Halcyon, who showed up one Monday to find their badges deactivated and a severance envelope on the desk. 40 of them in the first round. None of them had thrown anything at anyone. That is how it almost always works, and the story would be lying to you if it pretended otherwise. The board watched for as long as it could stand to. The chairwoman was a woman named Catherine Ellison, who had sat on the board for 11 years and had spent the last 2 of them increasingly unable to look at Preston during meetings. She began making phone calls, the quiet kind, the kind that do not show up on any calendar. And then she made the one that changed everything. An emergency session. Friday, 8 a.m., mandatory. No agenda circulated. Preston walked in expecting to run it, because he had run every meeting in that room for 2 decades. He had on his best suit and a speech about resilience and vision in difficult times. He pushed open the doors of the boardroom, the same mahogany table where a script had hit the floor, and he found that not one person turned to look at him. Every face in the room was pointed at the far wall, at the screen, where a press release was projected in clean high definition across the whole width of the room. The Halcyon Pictures logo at the top, and beneath it a photograph of a man in a plain dark jacket, and beneath that a name. Preston's legs stopped working for a full second, because the man in the photograph, calm and unstyled and looking directly into the camera, was the man he had thrown out of this room. And the headline above the photograph read that Halcyon Pictures, in partnership with Ridgeline, had set its next film, an untitled drama to be produced by and starring the founder of Halcyon, with principal photography to begin in the spring. Ridgeline, Meridian's oldest rival. The studio Preston had spent 20 years dismissing in interviews as a boutique with delusions. Keanu had not merely walked his project away. He had walked it directly into the hands of the one company best positioned to use it as a knife. "Sit down, Preston," Catherine Ellison said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. For the first time in 22 years, Preston Hargrove sat where he was told. The room he sat in was not the room he had walked into. It was the same mahogany, the same windows, the same view of the city, Kensif the city, but 3 of the 12 chairs held different people now, because 3 executives had already quietly resigned rather than have their names attached to what was coming. And the 9 who remained were not looking at Preston the way subordinates look at a chief executive. They were looking at him the way people look at a wreck on the side of the road, with a horror that has some relief folded into it, the relief of those who were close enough to have been in the car and were not. Catherine had spent 2 weeks on the phone, assembling this moment, calling board members one at a time, walking each of them carefully to the edge of the thing so that when they arrived in this room they would arrive already decided. She had not enjoyed it. She was not a vengeful woman. She was a tired one, tired in the specific way of a person who has known for years that something was wrong in a place she was responsible for, and had told herself each year that it was not yet bad enough to be worth the war of fixing it. She knew now that she had been wrong about that. The thing had always been bad enough. She had simply not wanted the war. The man in the worn jacket had started it for her, without meaning to, by being thrown out of a room, and now she meant to finish it. Catherine let the room hold the silence for a moment, and then she spoke, evenly, the way a surgeon speaks before delivering news no one wants. 2 weeks ago, the founder of Halcyon Pictures came to this building, in person, to decide whether to set the most valuable independent package in this town with us. He brought it himself. He sat in this room. And you threw his script on the floor and called him a car detailer and ordered him out of the building in front of 12 members of this company's senior staff. She let that land. His name is in front of you. You have been in this industry for 30 years. You knew the name. You simply never looked at the man. Preston's mouth worked. How was I supposed to? He came in here dressed like. He stopped. He could hear, even as he said it, how it was going to sound played back. And he was right to be afraid of how it would sound, because it was about to be played back, many times, to a great many people. There was a recording. There is almost always a recording now. One of the 12 executives at the table that morning had, as was standard practice, set a phone face down to capture the meeting for notes, and the phone had captured all of it, every word, and within a few more days, the relevant 30 seconds of it would be on every entertainment news outlet and a fair number of the regular ones. Preston Hargrove's voice, crystal clear. Who let this guy in here? Somebody who looks like he came to fix the air conditioning, pick up your little stack of papers, and get out of my building. 30 seconds of audio that no amount of public relations could soften. Because there was nothing in it to soften, it was simply a man being exactly who he was, when he believed no one who mattered was listening. But before the audio, before the press, there was just the boardroom, and Catherine Ellison, and a single quote at the bottom of the press release that she now read aloud, because she wanted Preston to hear it in her voice. It was the only public comment the founder of Halcyon had made, and it did not mention Preston, or Meridian, or the morning by name. It said, "I make films with people who treat a stranger with respect before they know what the stranger can do for them. That is the entire test. It is not a hard test. Some people fail it anyway." The room was quiet. Catherine set down the remote. "You did not lose us a film, Preston," she said. "You showed us who runs this studio when he thinks no one important is watching. The trouble is that everyone turned to be important. That is generally how it turns out. Now let me tell you where everyone landed, because nothing here landed evenly, and a story that told you it did would be a lie dressed up as justice." Preston Hargrove was removed as chief executive of Halcyon Pictures by a unanimous vote the following week. That part was clean and certain, but he did not go to prison, because being a contemptible man in a boardroom is not a crime, and Keanu Reeves never filed a lawsuit against him, never sought $1 from him, never spoke his name in public at all. When Eli Brandt asked him, once, whether he wanted to pursue it, Keanu said no, and the reason he gave was the truest thing in this whole story. "I don't need to do anything to him," he said. "I just need to stop standing between him and the consequences of being himself. Those will do the work. They always do, and they did." No studio would hire Preston after the audio went around. His name became a thing people said as a warning. He landed, eventually, in a consulting arrangement at a far smaller company in a far smaller market. And he told anyone who would listen a version of events in which he had been ambushed, set up, destroyed by a celebrity stunt and a politically correct mob. And he believed it, every word. Because believing it was the only version that let him sleep. And some men never trade that version for the truth, no matter how much the truth costs them. He never apologized. Not to Keanu, not to the 40 people who lost their jobs, not to anyone. That is the part the story will not soften for you, because softening it would be its own small lie. Howard Keller was named interim chief executive. His first act in the job was to stand in the lobby, in front of the bench by the supply closet, and read aloud a public apology. And the apology was not for Preston. It was for himself. For knowing who the man on the bench was and saying nothing. For sitting in a chair and watching a thing he knew was wrong, and choosing the safety of silence over the cost of one sentence. His voice broke twice, and he did not try to hide it. Whether Howard Keller became a braver man after that morning, or merely a guiltier one, the story does not pretend to know, because a single public apology is not the same as a changed life, and the distance between them is where most of us actually live. Keanu never responded to the apology publicly. But Howard received, a few weeks later, a short note in plain handwriting on plain paper. It said only, "Saying it out loud took more than staying quiet would have." That counts. And it was not signed, but Howard knew the hand. The 40 people who lost their jobs mostly found other ones, in time, though not all of them, and not at the same level, and the months in between were hard in ways that no press release ever captured. Some of them never connected their layoff to a morning on the 41st floor, and never will. That is also part of the truth. The wreckage of a cruel man's pride does not fall on the cruel man alone. It rarely does. There was more after the audio, because there always is. The thing about cruelty is that it is almost never a single moment. It is a habit, and a habit leaves a trail, and once one person pulls a thread, the whole garment starts to come apart. a journalist named Andrea Stone, who covered the industry for one of the trade outlets and had a reputation for not letting go of a thing once she had her teeth in it, did not stop at the audio. She kept calling, and within 2 weeks of the recording going public, 3 former Meridian employees called her back, and they did not need to be coaxed, because they had been waiting years for someone to ask. The first was a development executive named Marisol Vega, who had spent 6 years at the studio and had watched projects she championed. Projects with directors and writers who did not fit Preston's idea of what a filmmaker looked like, die quietly and turn around while glossier, emptier packages sailed through. She had the emails. The second was a line producer named Curtis Lane, who described being pulled off a prestige project because, in Preston's words, the financier needs to see a certain kind of face running the set, and who had said nothing at the time and had carried it ever since. The third was a young assistant named Devon Marsh, 2 years out of film school, who had been in the room for things that were said when Preston believed the room was friendly, and who had kept a careful, dated record of all of them, not because he ever expected anyone to read it, but because writing them down was the only way he could prove to himself that he had not imagined how the place actually worked. 3 people, 3 trails, years of silence coming open at once. Andrea Stone wrote it all, carefully with documentation, and the picture that emerged was not of one bad morning but of a pattern. A studio that for a long time had quietly decided certain kinds of people did not get to sit at certain tables and had called that decision taste. It was not taste. It had never been taste. It had only ever been the same arrogance that threw a script on a floor, wearing a more respectable suit, and Walter Pruitt. Walter, who had carried a cup of water across a cold lobby on a bad hip to a man he had recognized and chosen to let be, did not lose anything and gain something, though here, too, the story will not tie the ribbon too tightly. Because the thing that lifted Walter Pruitt in the end was not justice. It was luck. It was the accident of having been kind to the one stranger in 10,000 who happened to have the power to be kind back. There are a great many Walter Pruitts carrying cups of water to people who will never be in a position to return the gesture, and they do it anyway, and nobody projects a press release about them onto a boardroom wall. Keanu knew that. It was the thing he thought about most, afterward. What Keanu could do, he did. When the stuntman picture went into production at Ridgeline that spring, there was an old man on the set with a credit that had been created for him. A consultant on a period crew sequence. A man who had been a grip 50 years before, and who knew, it turned out, exactly how the old rigs were tied off, and who spent 3 of the happiest months of his late life on a film set again. Because a stranger he had handed a cup of water had not forgotten. There was a weekend between the board vote and the public unraveling, when Preston tried to undo what could not be undone. And it is worth telling because it is the closest the man ever came to seeing himself clearly. And he turned away from it. He sat in his house in the hills, a house far larger than the one Keanu lived in and far emptier, and he drafted messages to a man whose name he had finally, belatedly, learned. The first draft was a threat, full of words like contractual interference and consequences, and he read it back and heard a man swinging at the air and deleted it. The second was businesslike, proposing a conversation, a reset, using the phrase mutual benefit 3 times, and he read it back and heard a man begging while pretending not to, and he sent it anyway. Nothing came back. The third, on Sunday night, had no armor left on it at all. It said only that he thought perhaps he had misjudged the situation and would welcome the chance to talk. He stared at it for 20 minutes before he sent it. Nothing came back from that one either. Keanu never saw the messages. They went to an address that was filtered to a folder no one opened, and that was not cruelty. It was simply the same answer Keanu had given in the boardroom. The answer of a man who had decided another man was no longer his concern. Preston had made Keanu irrelevant with a glance. Keanu made Preston irrelevant with silence. Only one of them had been right about the other. The closing scene is a small one, a few months on. It is lunch on a soundstage at Ridgeline, the middle of a shooting day. and the crew is eating at long folding tables under the work lights, the way crews do. The grips beside the executives, beside the drivers, beside the stars. The one genuinely democratic hour of a film set. A man in a worn jacket carries his tray to the long table and sits down in the middle of it, not at the end, not apart, in the middle, and the people around him make room without making a fuss. A young production assistant, 3 weeks into her first job, not yet sure who is who on a set this size, slides down to make space and pushes the salt toward him and says, easy and unforced, "There's better coffee at the second cart if you don't mind the walk." The urn here's been burnt since Tuesday. Good to know, Keanu says, and means it, and takes the worst coffee anyway, and they eat. She does not know, that young woman, that the man she just made room for is the reason the film exists, the reason her first job exists. She just saw a person looking for a seat and made one. And that, more than the press release, more than the board vote, more than the look on Preston Hargrove's face when the screen lit up, is the thing he had driven to Halcyon Pictures to find, weeks ago, in a borrowed jacket, on a quiet morning. Whether a place would be decent to a stranger before it knew what the stranger was worth. Meridian had failed the test. This table, today, with this young woman and her warning about the burnt coffee, passed it without knowing it was being given. Across the soundstage, Walter Pruitt was showing a young grip how they used to tie a rig in 1974, his bad hip forgotten, his hands sure, and he caught Keanu's eye across the room and lifted his paper coffee cup an inch. A small private salute, and Keanu lifted his back. I keep coming back to the man with the cup of water. Not the press release, not the boardroom, not the moment the screen lit up, and the room understood at once what Preston had done. The cup of water. Walter Pruitt crossed a cold lobby on a bad hip to bring a paper cup of water to a man parked by a supply closet. A man he had every social permission to ignore the way the rest of the building ignored him, and he did it before he had any idea who the man was, which is the only part that actually matters. We want this to be a story about power, about a quiet billionaire who could move $200 million with a phone call and bring a tower of arrogance down without raising his voice. And it is that. A little. But that is the least interesting thing in it. The thing that stays with me is that the only person in that entire glass tower who passed the test was the one man in it with the least power of anyone, the old security guard with the bad hip, who had nothing to gain and gave the kindness anyway. Preston Hargrove looked at a stranger and calculated what he was worth, and got the calculation catastrophically wrong. Walter Pruitt looked at the same stranger and never ran the calculation at all. That is the whole difference between them, and it has nothing to do with money. And everything to do with the kind of attention you decide to pay to a person before you know what they can do for you. That is the part that stays with me. While this story is fictional, the lessons about who we choose to see and who we look straight through are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.